In our lecture today, we're going to be covering topics such as scale, repetition, and unity. So we're going to begin with scale. And we've talked about scale before in this class in terms of creating space. The trees on the left-hand side of this image reduce in scale, leading us back down this snow-covered street. So objects closer to us appear larger than those farther away. We've also recently talked about scale in terms of creating a focal point. In this case, it's hieratic scale or hierarchical scale, where the largest figure, and in this painting it's the Madonna and Child, are more important than any of the other figures. But today we're going to talk about scale in terms of proportion. They deal with the dimensions of the art object itself, or the elements within the art object, in relation to other elements or some mental norm or standard. And I know that was kind of a dense definition, but when we look at the examples, we're going to be able to see how this plays out. Probably one of the most famous paintings that deals with scale and proportion are the Daughters of Edward Darley BOIT. And this was a famous physician back in the late 1800s, and he had a friend, John Singer Sargent, who was a famous American portraitist. So he painted the daughters of this doctor. But when we look at this image, it's a little disturbing because these girls are standing nearby these absolutely gigantic vases. And it gives us very much an Alice in Wonderland effect about it. So the idea of the mental norm that we have for a vase is something that's maybe a foot tall, a foot and a half tall, certainly not 4 to 5 feet tall. So we have to kind of process that through our brain. We see a lot of times scale and proportion playing off each other in terms of surrealism and pop art. So this is a surrealist image, and again, we have to kind of fit the idea in our brains what's going on here. Are we looking at a room that has supersized objects such as a comb or a matchstick? Or are we looking at normal sized objects in a room in a dollhouse? And here we have a work of pop art, and we can see this gigantic stamp that's laying on its side out in a park area. We'll talk about pop art later on in this lecture. Surrealism will be presented in our lecture on modern art. But those were dealing mostly with objects within the artwork itself. What about the size of a painting? How does that change our reception of it? When we look at Napoleon crossing the Alps, and this is a fantastic painting, it is literally floor to ceiling when you stand in front of it. It's awe-inspiring, and when we put it on a screen, whether it's a computer screen or whether it's a projector screen in a classroom, it fits the size of the screen for us to see the detail work. It doesn't have anything at all to do with the true size of this painting. The same can be said for this painting too. It doesn't matter the true size of the work, it just needs to expand to fit the entire screen. And I will tell you, I have seen both of these artworks in person, and the reception you get from these works is completely different. In reality, they look like this. The Napoleon painting is actually larger than generally the screen that you're going to see it on in a classroom. Whereas the other one, the Bathers by Fragonard, which is a fantastic painting still, and I remember when I was taking French art as a student in my undergrad university that my teacher hyped it up. We saw it on the projector screen. It was going to be at the Getty Museum here in Southern California. We made a field trip to go out and see it. drove 2 hours in the rain, and we stood around this painting, which was a little bit larger than a postcard. It was so underwhelming and so disappointing to see. It's a beautiful painting, but it just wasn't what I was expecting, and it had to deal with the scale and proportion of the artwork. So now we're going to move on to repetition and rhythm. Rhythm is an element of design which is based on the repetition of recurrent motifs. Basically, what this means is that we're going to be using the same visual element over and over again within the same composition. We normally think of rhythm as something audible. The rhythm takes us through the song. Well, the same thing can be said in terms of visual rhythm. It takes our eyes through the patterns in an artwork. A work like this has repetition and rhythm. It's that use of undulating line throughout. And even something a little bit more subtle in terms of repetition and rhythm, where we have this sculpture called The Gates of Hell by Rodin, and on top of the sculpture is another kind of separate work called The Three Shades. It is the same sculpture, it is just turned 3 different ways. And then we have this really cool photograph of an empty parking lot. This was taken during the 1960s. This is a Southern California location. It is Goodyear Tires in North Hollywood. And we can see toward the building itself, we've got these lines that make up these parking spaces moving away from the building. But also moving away is the amount of oil stains that we have in these particular parking lots. So we have a very much more subtler rhythm corresponding as well. The person who took that photo is Ed Ruscha, and we'll talk about him later in this lecture as well, because he is a famous pop artist, and he published a book in the 60s called 36 Parking Lots of Los Angeles. And he has some very famous parking lots, such as Dodger Stadium in the lower left or the Hollywood Bowl in the upper right, but also some nondescript parking lots in the lower right-hand corner, for instance. And now we're going to move on to probably the most important part of this lecture, because I usually have an assignment based on the idea of unity with variety. So unity is the agreement that exists between the elements in a design, meaning they go together. It is a carefully controlled order within the artwork. Without some aspect of unity, an image is going to be chaotic and unreadable. Unity is created by repeating similar aspects within the composition to create a visual harmony. And I know that's some pretty dense information there. But again, it's the idea of being able to apply these definitions to the images. When we move to variety, we kind of already know what that is. It's diversification. Without some element of variety, an image is going to be lifeless and uninteresting. So we need something to bring it together, the unity, and then we also need to spice it up with variety. So variety can occur through any of the formal elements. We can have changes in value. We can apply different textures, or we can vary the shapes and sizes of the objects. So here is a work that has a lot of variety, but it doesn't have any unity. We have a whole bunch of street signs. Some are rectangular, some are square, some are circular. They have different colors. Some of them have words. Some of them have symbols. A lot of variety, not any unity though. The opposite is unity without variety, where we have this very disturbing image of these individuals sitting across from each other on a very long table. And we're looking at an image that brings us an idea of institutions or working on an assembly line. Everyone is dressed the same. They have the same facial expression. They have the same haircut. Their hands are positioned in the same order on the table in front of them. So we want to go somewhere in between those two extremes. Our goal as an artist is to create something between confusion and commonality. Like this work here. We've got irises, and we talked about this work already with vertical location. The higher the object is, the further back it is. But it is a very successful composition, even though it only uses one plant material, which is the Japanese iris. We've got different iris plants at different heights, in different groupings or clusters. When we look at the flowers, there's different values, there's different positions where they are open. So it really is a great work and definitely an example of unity with variety. Another work that has unity with variety. The unifying aspect here is that these are all desserts. They're all wedge-shaped. They're all in lines. They're all on circular plates. But the variety comes in with each row being a different dessert. So again, we have a great composition that portrays unity with variety. And so what I'd like to do now is kind of shift topics and talk about pop art, which is always a favorite of my students. And for a moment, what I'd like you to do, and you can pause the video, is to think about all the things that happened in the 1960s. And this can be on a political idea, this can be on culture, this can be in music, whatever topic you wanted to think about that deals with the 1960s, take a few moments and write them down. All right, so you've got your list of topics down. I'm going to go through some of the most famous things that happened during this decade. Of course, JFK becomes the youngest president elected. John Glenn becomes the first person to orbit the Earth. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Of course, we have the horrible assassination of President Kennedy. The first televised war, Vietnam. The Beatles are going to perform on Ed Sullivan. Also, the Rolling Stones have their first U.S. concert. The horrible assassination of MLK, as well as Robert Kennedy. Nixon becomes president in 1968. We have Woodstock. And we also have the cancellation of Star Trek. So pop art is really the art that magnifies what happens during this age. It is definitely considered an American art movement, but it has its origins in England. Richard Hamilton is the very first pop artist, and I'll show you his work in just a moment, and he's British. He defines pop art as transient or short-term, expendable or easily forgotten, low cost, mass-produced, young, witty, sexy, gimmicky, glamorous, and big business. And this is his work. And we consider these individuals the Adam and Eve of consumer culture, because that's really what pop art is about. It's about showing the advertising at the time. It's about popular culture. It is centered in New York, although there is an exponent in Los Angeles. And popular culture is the subject matter which bothered a lot of art critics because they didn't know if the artists were embracing it or if they were making fun of it. But the art could be inspired by anything, including comic books, advertisements, and television. What was enjoyable, though, about pop art, and why I think it resonates with our culture today, is that it's recognizable. It doesn't hide anything. There's no backstory. It's objects that we're familiar with. Sometimes pop art has been called the anti-art, but the main thing, and the third little segment there, is that art becomes industrialized in both imagery and production. So a lot of times here we have prints instead of unique artworks. We have imagery that's created in a series. What it was, though, was a response against abstract expressionism, which is the art of our parents. Abstract expressionism had been going on for 20 years. People like Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, Lee Krasner, Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, Helen Frankenthaler, and Morris Louis. That was the artist that our parents enjoyed if we were living during the 1960s, and they had been producing art since the end of World War II. But now we have a generational switch where we have a new group of young artists that take center stage. Artists such as Claus Oldenburg and Tom Wesselmann, James Rosenquist, Roy Lichtenstein, and of course, Andy Warhol. So we'll look at Claus Oldenburg first. And he's famous for these absolutely gigantic objects. Again, we're looking at art that the objects themselves weren't thought to have any artistic qualities, a spoon and a cherry. But Claus Oldenburg makes this into this gigantic fountain for a park in Minneapolis. And that's the flip side of that work. You can see the fountain a little bit better in that image. And we have these in a whole bunch of major cities. I believe this one's in Cleveland. It's called House Ball. And this great book of matches. Tom Wesselmann is an artist who we've also seen earlier in the semester. We talked about his work with vertical location, but he was very famous for these collages. Here's another one, and he became so famous, in fact, that companies like Dole and Del Monte and Kellogg's started sending him packaging, hoping that he would include it in his works. What's great about these as well is that there's a three-dimensionality aspect. It's not just two-dimensional flat collage this guy is creating. And when we see that, this is just a stock photo of what this artwork looks like, but when we see it in person, we can see that that tile is real in the upper right-hand corner, that those are real bottles of 7-Up on top of a real front door of a refrigerator. So there's that excellent three-dimensionality to this work as well. James Rosenquist was famous for one particular work called F111. And this guy also had a background in working with art of this size. He was a person who would change out the imagery on billboards over the freeway. And so this artwork, even though it kind of looks small in this image, really is gigantic, and it is meant to be seen on separate walls. It is supposed to wrap around the room and basically encompass you in art. There's something like 81 different panels here that creates this work. And we have some imagery in it that, again, goes with that term recontextualization. For instance, in the middle of the scene here, we've got this nuclear bomb explosion, but it's masked as the same shape as the umbrella. The little girl who's sitting underneath a hairdryer, but the hairdryer looks much more like the top of a missile. We've got some other items in here as well, from a cracked egg to light bulbs to spaghetti and tires. And in the background, throughout the work, there is this F-111, and it is the most newest and important fighter plane that's being produced in the United States. The idea behind this work is that while we are paying for all these goods and services, we are also contributing tax money to create this warplane. And even though we may not be behind the war in Vietnam, we're still contributing to it by buying these goods and services. Roy Lichtenstein is famous for creating these comic book scenes, but monumentalizing them on a canvas. Golf ball, for instance. In 1962, as we saw in an earlier slide, this is when John Glenn circles the Earth. And so this work, even though it's called golf ball, looks very much like the moon because we're beginning our space race. The dimples in the golf ball look like craters on the moon. And we also don't have any area around this work, any landscape, to help cement this object on the ground. It looks like as if it's floating in the sky. And here, we're kind of moving away from the idea of the severity of war. We're almost like making it childlike in a way by forming it into a comic. And then we have Andy Warhol, who, even though he passed away in 1987, it really wasn't that long ago. And we haven't even cataloged all of his works yet. So I think when we look back, maybe 50 years from now, we'll realize how important Andy Warhol was in the progression of art in the late 20th century. I'm going to show you a short video, and then we're going to get back to our lecture.
I knew and met Andy Warhol in the 80s. He was all over New York all the time, and I asked him in a nightclub if he would sign some soup cans for me. And the guy's like, sure, you bet. Oh, bring them by my studio tomorrow. I'm like, okay.
So you became friendly with Andy, and he gave you these great autographs. And then you got this beautiful print.
I loved it, and I got this from Andy for $125.
Oh, wow.
And again, I went down to his studio I took my mom and my sister, and we all went down there, and it was really great. I mean, this guy was so friendly that there was no coming out of his mouth. He loved people, and he was also very interested in your story, like where you were from, what you do.
Let's take a look at the back of this, too. You have some other things on here. We have some interview magazines.
Interview magazines. Andy was publishing this magazine called Interview at the time, and the guy had a stack of interview magazines. So he would sign them, and I got him to sign, Robin Williams, and like, meow, with the cat. And I love Molly Ringwald. They called her Molly Ringworm, and then Richard Pryor.
Yeah.
So it's really, really funny that he would sign them and, draw funny things on them. And I loved, I love this two-part Love Andy Warhol.
Yeah, I was going to point this out, which is really great. We have the back of the print, which is properly numbered, rubber stamped, and signed, and then dedicated in pencil to you.
And I asked him to sign the front, and he said, he would never sign the front of his pieces.
Mm-hmm. Let's flip this around. So, let's talk about the cans. Again, this is something Andy did. His iconic work on the Campbell soup can, people began to bring cans for him to sign. What's great about your cans, a number of them he signed twice.
He signed twice, yep.
Now, as far as the cans go, these have become very collectible, obviously, over the years. And he signed a lot, but it doesn't matter because they're very, very iconic and people love them. And you have a great provenance, a great story that goes behind these.
It's a fun story,
you got these directly from him. If I were estimating these at auction, I would estimate the individual cans at $1,500 to $2,000 a piece.
Nice.
Yeah. So you got 6 of them there.
This
Not
expensive
bad.
can of soup, very nice.
Absolutely.
Good.
The interview magazines are great, and what's really nice is that he did the little extra touches. He signed a lot, but he didn't always do the extra touches. I would estimate those at $1,000 to $1,500.
Shut up.
Not at all. Now, this one's great. What really makes this print spectacular is the color. It really pops. This is actually from the late 60s, and of course you have the wonderful dedication on the back. A conservative estimate at auction would probably be about $15,000 to $20,000.
No!
So,
Mom, did you hear that? We're going to Acapulco for the weekend.
So,
Oh, God.
I mean,
No,
great
no
investment.
way.
Great investment for
God.
$125.
No, $125. And he had to hold my check because payday was the next week. Unbelievable.
Well, and we were all very excited to see it.
Oh.
So I hope you enjoyed that little snippet from the Antiques Roadshow. Andy Warhol does have a very interesting life. There was an assassination attempt on him on June 3rd, 1968. But I am going to focus in on a lot of the different works that he created throughout his lifetime. And again, he has some wonderful quotes if you ever decide to look them up. And also published is his diaries. And again, this is someone who was meticulous. He would write down how much a cab fare cost him going across town in New York. One of his quotes is, "I want to be a machine." And I think printmaking and repeating the idea of a figure many times is prevalent in his artwork. In this case, this car crash seen multiple times desensitizes us to the event that really happened. He was actually freaked out about the street itself and about cars and the idea that cars offered us this false sense of security that really could be changed at any moment, and a car crash definitely proves that. The 210 bottles of Coca-Cola is another great work of unity with variety, that unifying aspect of that iconic Coca-Cola bottle. But the variety with it being twisted in different ways or having different amounts of fluid within the bottles. He also has a great quote about Coca-Cola, about how each of us has the opportunity to buy really the perfect drink, that no amount of money could get us a better bottle of Coke than anyone else could, whether it's the president or movie stars or someone who was homeless. We all have the opportunity to get the same Coca-Cola. And of course, the Campbell soup cans are definitely iconic. And it is funny to think about when he first sold these, he didn't sell out of his series. And he was only asking, but it was a lot of money at the time, $100 for these. Whereas today they are more about $1 million in terms of their value. When asked by a critic why he did this series, he responded, "I had soup for lunch every day for 20 years. And this is one of the reasons Warhol is really important in the history of art. Before Warhol, if an artist made a statement, the artist's word was taken as the gospel. After Andy Warhol, we don't see that. We see the rise of the critic because we don't believe this person of what he's saying. This is the super dress. And he would take these iconic imagery, something as basic as a box of soap, which you see here, and make it into art. This work here of Marilyn Monroe, and he utilized a lot of celebrities because he said that they were really, what promoted America. Not only did Coca-Cola and Campbell Soup speak to nationalism, but so did these individuals such as Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor, Elvis Presley. This image here is very much like Giotto's Enthroned Madonna that we see at right. And here's another one of unity with variety. It's called Marilyn times 100. The last pop artist I want to talk about is Ed Ruscha, and he is still with us. He is in his 80s, and he is a Southern California pop artist. His works include Every Building on the Sunset Strip, which is a very unique book because it folds out to about 27 feet long, and it does show a photo of every building on the Sunset Strip. That white space in between, at the very center, I should say, of the book is the street itself, and we have upside down photos of the other side of the street, of the buildings there. He's the one that gave us also 37 Parking Lots of Los Angeles. He gave us the Standard Station that we talked about in 2-point perspective. Step on No Pets, which dealt with symmetrical balance. And this is a work that we had at the LA County Museum of Art, which this is the way the museum looked in the 1960s, and of course he puts the Amundsen building on fire. So it is a fantastic painting. But here I'm going to end our lecture on scale, repetition, and unity.